What if I told you that the most chaotic downfall of a government ever was that of Nazi Germany? Well, to anybody who even understands the smallest part of details of that part of history, this is not going to surprise you. What could surprise you, though, some of the details that were involved in this chaotic ending. And so that's what I'm here today to share. As you know, Nazi Germany was defeated convincingly by the Allied powers in 1945, ending World War II in Europe. It did not end in Japan for another few months, but that's going to be a different episode. So let's go to April of 1945. The Allied powers are crushing in on Germany on all four sides. The Americans and the French and the British are coming from the west and southwest, and the Russians are coming from the east and northeast. Now, Berlin had been, in April of 1945, Berlin had been completely surrounded and cut off from the rest of what remained of Nazi Germany. April 23rd of 1945, I believe to be the date that this actually occurred. Now, when this occurred, Adolf Hitler was still in his bunker, in the Fuhrer bunker. And he had a decision he had to make. How was the defense of Berlin going to be conducted? Now, there was a man who he had evicted from the Wehrmacht under auspices of him initiating a surrender to the Allied forces in the West. His name was Helmuth Weidling. But then Hitler brought Weidling back to his bunker that day and discovered that this report was false. Weidling never had ordered a surrender at all. He would eventually go to do so. That's the backside of the story. Now, Hitler correctly knew that the only person capable of any sort of competent defense of Berlin, the capital and the city that he was hiding in, was Weidling. And so, on April 23rd, he made Weidling the commander of the defense of Berlin. A good move. It would ultimately fail, but given the circumstances, Weidling did put up a competent defense, relatively speaking, given the fact that the Germans were down to 80,000 men and the Russians were coming specifically with 2 million. You're just not going to win that particular situation. However, Weidling's defense was very competent. He broke the city of Berlin down to 8 different zones. Each one had its own defense preparations. And some of these defense preparations were pretty elaborate. Berlin had been bombed over the previous several months, so there was a lot of debris in the streets. When you've got a lot of debris in the streets of a city, it actually favors the defense, and Weidling knew this. And so Weidling had elaborate defenses set up with whatever few tanks he had left. He didn't have many. He had maybe a couple hundred left. And used the debris as defensive material, and so which gave any German defenders that he had available to him the ability to shoot from behind debris and conduct a defense this way. Now, the entire event became a tremendous blood fiesta of insane proportions, but at the same time, he did inflict as much casualties and loss on the Soviets as he possibly could. Overall, a couple 100,000 people on both sides died in the Battle of Berlin. Now, fast forward to April 29th, Hitler's in the bunker. The air raid sirens are going off. He retreats to his bedroom and offs himself, which he told all of the people in his inner circle that he was going to do. However, he did not tell anybody above. And so Hitler, having removed himself from the planet, on April 29th, the dissolution of Nazi Germany was conducted through his final will and testament, political will and testament that one of his secretaries, Charles Junge, had written down and dictated the day before, on April 28th of 1945. So April 29th, 1945, Hitler goes bye-bye. The people above have no idea of this, including Weidling, including his defenders. So they continue to fight for the defense of Berlin, not knowing that their Führer, their leader, was gone. That said, word did reach the surface on May 1st, when it was announced from the Führer bunker itself through national radio. And of course they told a big, huge lie, no surprise, that Führer died in Berlin fighting to his last breath against Bolshevism, which is the Soviet belief system. Now, this is May 1st. Now, this dictated testament was still being transmitted to the associated parties. I'll go through that in just a minute. But Weidling catches this radio broadcast and he's like, what the hell am I doing? He knew the gig was up. The Soviets were just had him outnumbered about, 15-1. They were not going to win. Weidling, being a member of the Wehrmacht and not the SS, came to the only logical conclusion possible. And that was the gig was up. Weidling was not some sort of Nazi fanatic. He was a member of the Wehrmacht, the traditional Prussian army. So he came to the logical conclusion. The gig is up. We can't fight anymore. And so he decided the next day on May 2nd that his army wasn't going to. He surrendered Berlin on May 2nd of 1945. And the 70,000 remaining men and soldiers with him. So he walked or did whatever he could in the middle of that blood fiesta to General Georgy Zhukov of the 1st Belarusian Front, who was the occupying force within the city at large at this time. Went over to his headquarters, formally surrendered. So Berlin was surrendered, but here's the kicker. Germany wasn't yet. But by and large it was, because almost all of the battle and fighting was in Berlin at this time. You had very small micro pockets of resistance still ongoing. But these people did not surrender. And here's why. Hitler's final will and testament provided for a successor. And this did not reach that person until, May 2nd. Took 2.5 days. His name was Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz. And he was based in the northern part of Germany at this point, about 100 miles north of Berlin, in a town called Plön. That said, the Soviets were making a rapid advance from the east, even up there. So he fled towards the Danish border and wound up in a city called Flensburg, which still exists today. So he was in Flensburg. Hitler had appointed him as Vice President or the Reich President, not the Führer. So he was officially in charge of what was left of Nazi Germany, which at this point was just the small pockets in northern Germany, which is where he was, as well as Austria, the Sudetenland, and parts of Czechoslovakia. Now, so this nominal government, farce of a government, existed up by the Danish border. It had not surrendered yet. The will and testament of Adolf Hitler also provided for a couple of other things. It provided for a new head of the Nazi Party, which was Martin Bormann. Martin Bormann, of course, was Hitler's private secretary. But by this point, there was no Nazi party worth leading, no Nazi party that was really functioning at all. With the Fuhrer gone, the machinery of the Nazi party ceased to exist. So it was what was called a Pyrrhic victory for Bormann. Bormann fled the Fuhrer bunker on the 2nd of May. It also provided for a successor of prime minister, that being Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda chief. That said, this part of the document never went into force. Actually did, for 24 hours. So after Hitler canceled himself from the planet, this part of the Will and Testament went into force, and Goebbels was the nominal prime minister of the German Republic at this point, and the head of the Reichstag, the administrative body or legislative body, which hadn't met in years, by the way, and the building, of course, the garden under which the Fuhrer bunker sat, was completely destroyed. It had no capability of functioning whatsoever. That said, Goebbels did one thing. He attempted to broker a peace agreement with the Soviets. The Soviets and all the Allies by this point, of course, were under the only surrender will accept is unconditional. So on May 1st, his one shot at a negotiated surrender was rejected. And then on May 1st, him and his wife Magda took their 6 children, committed suicide, and he murdered his own children. Because they just could not see a world without National Socialism. If there was going to be a Germany without it, they didn't want to be a part of it. So this is another part of the Will and Testament that came into being, but for 24 hours, and then of course they removed themselves from the planet, and the Goebbels family went into history. Now meanwhile, up in Flensburg, you've got this nominal government running. There were other people that were involved with Dönitz. The main accomplishment of the Dönitz government was that in refusing to formally surrender, that he was able to conduct a mass evacuation of both military and some civilians from the eastern part of Germany to the west, where they were able to surrender to the Western Allies instead of the Soviets. Any generals that surrendered to the Soviets, you could count their life expectancy in minutes by this point. They were not interested in anything other than cold-hearted revenge. So this was a nominal success to some extent by Dönitz. But he did have a cabinet. Schwerin von Krosigk was the name of the man who became the head of the cabinet. With Goebbels, of course, off the planet now, Schwerin von Krosigk became the successor in this role. On Dönitz's suggestion. There was also a armaments minister, which was the old armaments minister who continued in his position from the original Reich, and that, of course, being Albert Speer. He was in Flensburg as well. These men conducted whatever little business they possibly could at this point, given that 95% of the country was in Allied control. They had no control over anything outside of the immediate few hundred yards outside of their headquarters in Flensburg, and very small pockets and very small villages in Austria and Czechoslovakia. That's it. They had control of nothing else. The Allies controlled the rest of the country entirely, including the Alpine Redoubt and Berchtesgaden in the southeastern part of Germany in the Bavarian Alps. Now this is where you would have found the head of the Luftwaffe and the official designated successor from the 1942 Succession Act, Hermann Goering. Goering had attempted to take over the government earlier in April of 1945, using this very real act as the instrument in which to do it. Now, of course, Bormann had caught wind of this and received the telegram that Goering had sent from the Bavarian Alps, presented it to Hitler as treason, had Goering kicked out of the Nazi Party, stripped of all posts and positions. So this potential successor was out of the picture by this point. So Goering later would go on in the first week of May 1945, surrender to the Western Allies who were in control of the Bavarian Alps by this point. So the official successor couldn't do squat. You had a designated successor in hiding in the northern border of the country. You had a head of the Nazi Party who really couldn't do anything at all, and he eventually tried to escape on May 2nd, 1945. The mystery of Martin Bormann was one of the great mysteries of the 20th century, because Stalin benefited from communicating that he had escaped to South America. It was later found out in 1972 that, with Morgan Freeman narrating the script, that indeed Martin Bormann had not escaped to Argentina. The head of the Nazi Party had indeed been killed trying to escape the bunker. But his forensic remains were not found until 1972 in a Berlin construction project on the site. So he was gunned down, apparently from the autopsy results, trying to cross the Spree River and head north into the northern part of Berlin, and eventually with a plan to escape westbound to meet the Western Allies and surrender there. But Bormann never made it out alive, so the head of the Nazi Party is dead. And now you have a designated successor from the original act surrendered. You have an actual acting president now controlling a very small, maybe a couple acre plot of land in a small German city north of Hamburg on the Danish border named Flensburg, who Dönitz was actually the head of the Navy. So he was a naval officer. Why did Hitler pick Dönitz? Well, by this point his inner circle was a seething pool of vindictive, incompetent men such as Goering, such as Bormann. Hitler didn't feel like he could trust any of them. So he was going to trust the one man who actually did deliver results. Goering didn't deliver results because he allowed it to get to this point. He allowed Berlin to be bombed. Dönitz, meanwhile, was the architect of the U-boat campaign, one of the greatest German successes, military-wise, during the war. He had merchant ships sunk by the millions of tons in the North Atlantic Ocean. He successfully cut off commerce and shipment of military supplies between the United States and the United Kingdom. And so because Dönitz was actually successful in some regard, one of the few in Hitler's elements of power that was, he got the assignment. He just decided he was going to negotiate his way to the end of this as best he could, and he did. He was able to successfully move a few 100,000 Germans to Western surrender and not Eastern surrender. There are probably hundreds of thousands of people in Germany today who owe their lives to this man because their ancestors were able to successfully surrender to the Western Allies. So this absolute chaotic series of events with a fictitious government that the Soviets wanted nothing to do with. They didn't want it to exist. But Churchill, being the pragmatist that he was, figured that it made sense for this legal fiction to go on for a while. And it did until the 23rd of May, 1945. So about 3 weeks. Dönitz, Speer, von Krosigk, and everybody around him finally surrendered to the British Allies on a nearby ship outside of Flensburg. May 23rd, 1945. This, for practical purposes, was the end of what remained of Nazi Germany. There was no mechanism left. The reason why the Flensburg government was allowed to continue, in Churchill's mind, and with Truman by this time agreeing. Roosevelt, of course, died on April 12th of 1945 in Georgia. So President Truman and Prime Minister Churchill, by this point, allowed it to continue for one very simple logical reason. It was the only existing mechanism to effect a total surrender of Nazi Germany to the Allies. The only practical way for this to even happen. Otherwise, this chaotic ending is even more chaotic. Because then there wouldn't be a mechanism to effect a surrender, and no means to wind down the fighting forces of the SS and the German Wehrmacht. Speaking of the SS, that leaves one guy missing in this entire story. The head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler. Himmler had attempted to negotiate a surrender a few weeks earlier with Count Folke Bernadotte of the Swedish Red Cross. This news of this, of course, reached Hitler in his Führer bunker that month, and the volcanic fury, of course, that was legendary for him by this point, totally erupted. He gave Himmler the same treatment as Goering, and that is banned him from all posts within the Nazi Party, kicked him out of the Nazi Party, ordered his arrest, and ordered his execution. Hitler took this alleged betrayal rather personally, because Himmler was always the loyal one to him. So this whole surrender is effected without a head of the SS available to effect a surrender of that military unit at all. Just to add to the cast just a little bit more, Himmler did make an appearance in Flensburg and pleaded with Dönitz to be part of his government. And Dönitz said, no, there's no role here for you. And there wasn't. Hitler then proceeded to be on the run for a couple more weeks after this. He dressed himself as a regular Wehrmacht soldier, which of course he wasn't. He was the head of the SS. He was captured at a British checkpoint in the northwestern part of Germany, close to the Black Sea coast. The Baltic Sea coast. The British took off his disguise and realized who they had. They had caught the big fish. He had tried to identify himself as Heinrich Hitzinger, but it was really Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS military group. However, before he could be questioned, before he could be taken fully into captivity, he had been traveling with a cyanide capsule, bit down on it, and died there on the interrogation room in British captivity. So the last man who could have had any control of the situation had died days before the formal surrender on the 23rd of May 1945 by Dönitz. And the picture of their arrest was actually Dönitz, Speer, and von Krosigk. All three men were pictured being escorted by British naval staff into captivity. All three men would later go on to serve time in Spandau prison and be convicted at the Nuremberg trials in 1946. None of them were assessed the death penalty, by the way. Dönitz was sentenced to 10 years, Speer to 20. Von Krosigk also for 20. They spent their entire sentences at Berlin-Spandau prison, which was controlled by the four Allied powers. Now, their role in the ending of Nazi Germany, of course, there was plenty for them to be convicted of, but I'm sure their role in an orderly surrender was a mitigating factor in not having them assigned the death penalty like Bormann was given the death penalty in absentia because he was considered disappeared by that point with no knowledge of where he was, and they wouldn't find out for another 36 years, from 1946 to 1972. So there it is, guys. The most chaotic ending of a government in world history, the end of Nazi Germany in 1945. Will there be a repeat of this? Probably not. And probably not going to be even anything close to it. Because there's not to my knowledge, not any sort of rabid head of government, no head of government that far mentally gone. Even if the Russian Federation came to an end to this day, this would still not repeat itself. Because even though Putin is pretty far gone, he's not that far gone. And Putin doesn't have a rabid circle of followers like Hitler did. As a matter of fact, some of his circle of followers are probably the greatest threat to his rule. So without some of those circumstances, there's not going to be a repeat of this ever again. So the most chaotic ending to a nation or regime in history, Nazi Germany, 1945. I will be talking to you guys again later today and probably tomorrow as well. We'll be back with another episode and we'll see you later. Peace out, homies.